Quickly, before we begin, most of you will be aware that I was banned from YouTube and that this video is a re-upload. I just wanted to say thank you very much for watching and that the journey shall now continue on Rumble. Now more than ever, I should be much more reliant on your kind donations and subscriptions so that I can keep making these videos. So, if you enjoy this video, or if you've learned from my videos in the past and had ever considered donating or subscribing, then please do check the link in the description and sign up if you just want to support me or join our private Discord and Telegram. Thank you. Considering how recent the Empire was, it is in some ways surprising how forgotten the major figures of the British Empire actually are. Who today can truly say they know all that much about Robert Clive, David Livingstone, or even Lord Nelson? What can Canadians truly say of the life of Isaac Brock? What about Australians and Captain Cook? All has given way to Winston Churchill and Adolf Hitler. My channel, rather by compulsion in order to fix this warped view of history, has also fallen victim to this phenomenon. One name, however, stands above this trend simply due to the sheer impact he had on the history of so many nations, although still little is actually known about the man except his name and his ambition. In a half or two-thirds of a normal lifetime, Cecil Rhodes had accomplished far more than most other empire builders, corporate tycoons, and political giants of the 19th century combined. He had made a fortune, carved out countries, and governed an old colony and two new ones. Even the mention of his name in some regions of the world, or in university campuses, is enough to send leftists and many minorities into a seething rage, although they aren't quite sure why. So what's the big deal? What is everybody so upset about? Let's find out. This is the complete life of Cecil Rhodes. A couple things before we begin though. First of all, a quick disclaimer. This video is in no way, shape, or form political, and is purely a work of history. When it comes to South African history, there is obviously a lot of racial themes involved, and so I can only urge you not to overthink it, and simply to take this video for what it is. Be normal. Thank you. Secondly, this is where I would normally promote my Patreon, but I was recently banned for no reason. Up until now, Patreon was usually my main source of income, and so initially this was quite the predicament for me. Thanks to a huge outpouring of support from you guys, though, the situation is now much more manageable, as so many of you have made the switch over to Subscribestar or YouTube memberships. So, if you were a Patreon, or ever did consider signing up, then please do consider clicking one of the links in the description. It's the entire reason I'm able to do what I do, and I can't really put into words how grateful I am. Even the lowest tier helps immensely. Thank you. It was on the 5th of July, 1853, at Bishop Stratford, Hertfordshire, that Cecil Rhodes was born. Considering the thousands of pages written about his later life, it is perhaps surprising that so little has been written on his younger years. In fact, it is rather hard to imagine Cecil Rhodes as a child at all, given what he later became. Regardless, his parents were pretty typically Victorian. His father was Reverend Francis Rhodes, and his mother, Louisa Rhodes. Of his mother, Cecil once said, quote, "My mother got through an amazing amount of work. She must have had the gift of organization. But she was never flustered and seemed always to have ample time to listen to all our many, and, to us, vastly important affairs." End quote. The two of them would maintain a close relationship until the day Louisa died. With his father, meanwhile, the relationship was much more strained. Francis had his hands full to say the least with all his children, as well as his career, and, in general, he was a rather stern and impatient man. The two never really got along, and poor Cecil developed some rather crippling daddy issues. Cecil was one of 12 children, and there was nothing remarkable about his school career, in which he plodded along rather than actually achieving all that much. At school and at home, he was a typical moody loner who was both touchy and unapproachable. He was described as, quote, "a slender, delicate-looking boy, possessing a retiring nature and a high, proud spirit," end quote. Like most loners, Rhodes was also a dreamer, and he would later recall spending days on end daydreaming of all sorts except women or marriage, which he told himself he would avoid at a young age. Of dreams in general, Rhodes later admitted, quote, "My father, frequently, and I am now sure wisely, demolished many of my dreams, but when I had rebuilt them on practical lines, he was ready to listen again. He never failed to put his finger on the weak spots, and his criticism soon taught me to consider a question from every possible point of view," end quote. In a letter written to his aunt shortly after his 15th birthday, Cecil explained that he was torn between becoming a clergyman like his father or a barrister. He was more inclined towards the former, but the latter sounded like a more pleasant life to him. Regardless, it was not to be. Shortly after leaving school, the fragile young boy fell ill. The visit to the doctor's office wasn't a happy one, and although it isn't entirely clear, it seems Cecil had weak lungs. Herbert Rhodes, Cecil's brother, had long since wanted his brothers to join him in the cotton trade in Africa. The doctor's son later recalled, quote, "My father was able to tell him that there was no reason to think that the climate of South Africa would be harmful to him in any way, and that on the contrary, it should prove beneficial, and strongly advised him to accept the offer and join his brother over there." End quote. The whole idea appealed to Cecil himself, too, and he promptly rushed off to find a map of South Africa, which he studied until the following morning. Quote, "By which time Africa possessed my bones." End quote. After 2 months at sea, on the 1st of September 1870, Cecil Rhodes arrived in Durban, and his brother wasn't there to meet him. As it turned out, Herbert was off chasing diamonds, but he had made arrangements for his brother to be lodged somewhere until his return. Return he soon did, as the easily bored Herbert got sick of sorting through gravel. The duo then set off for the Umkomaas Valley to vote the cotton trade. Within a couple of months, they had 100 acres of cotton land under cultivation. Cecil quickly took to the work, and the two of them lived simply. There were 2 huts on the plantation, one for sleeping, and the other was a cross between a sitting room and a shop. An African servant was employed to cook them food. On Sundays, the two of them would go to church in Pietermaritzburg, and Herbert would often take the day off for a game of cricket in the nearby village. Cecil preferred not to stray far from the plantation and buried his head in his books, which he had brought from England. He only really made one friend in Natal, and this was Henry Caesar Hawkins, a boy of his own age who shared his determination. The two of them studied hard together and discussed plans for getting into Oxford without outside assistance. In March 1871, the now 18-year-old Cecil was left alone to run the plantation, as his brother went off chasing the latest diamond news. This did wonders for the boy's self-confidence, and he became especially good at handling African workers. In one of his earliest letters home, he explained how easy it was to get the Kaffirs, as he termed them, to work. Cecil was enjoying his time in the cotton business and was planning for the future. All these plans were quickly scampered, however, as a new bout of diamond fever began to sweep the country. Even Henry Hawkins abandoned his books and left for the diggings. Cecil had once written home, quote, "People out here do nothing but talk diamonds. Everyone is diamond mad. Of course, there is a chance of the diamonds turning out trumps, but I don't count much from them. You see, it is all chance. Herbert may find one, or he may find one of 100 carats. It is a toss-up. But cotton, the more you see of it, the more I am sure it is a reality. Not a fortune, and not attainable by everyone, but still, to one who has a good bit of land, money to start it properly, a fair road, and, above all, a good name among the Kaffirs, a very pleasant income." End quote. Soon enough, there was an astonishing find on a farm owned by the De Beers brothers. The announcement of the find here in the middle of July made even the most stable man giddy at the prospects. The stampede which followed was called New Rush, and this became the name of the new diggings. Herbert Rhodes was one of the first to peg out his claims, and he got lucky immediately. This was enough for Cecil. As soon as the last of the cotton crop had been harvested, he prepared to join his brother, and he set off on his 400-mile journey, bringing many of his books, mostly the classics, with him. He had arrived in South Africa as merely a boy, but he was now setting off in pursuit of diamonds as a man. Never again would he feel cotton fall through his fingers. By the time Cecil arrived in New Rush, it was a disorganized mess. The streets, they said, simply followed the course of the wheelbarrows. All town planning had gone out the window. Most of the town was just tents, but there were a few shacks that resembled actual structures, which served as hotels, billiard rooms, and storage houses. A contemporary wrote of New Rush, quote, "What a busy scene of life presented itself to you. There were hundreds of diggers, in every kind of garb. There were faces of every conceivable caste and colour of the human race. The Kaffir, the Englishman, the Hottentot and the Dutchman, the Fingo and the German, the Yankee and the Swede, the Frenchman and the Turk, the Norwegian and the natives, the Russian and the Greek. In fact, a smattering of people from every nation on the face of the earth, digging, sifting and sorting from morning till night, day after day, month after month, until they have obtained what they consider sufficient." End quote. New Rush was later to be called the Kimberley Mine, whereas the nearby Old Rush was the De Beers Mine. Cecil, as he did with cotton, immediately threw himself into his new line of work. Few men at New Rush were as busy as Cecil, and he soon became even busier as his brother left for England. This left the 18-year-old Cecil alone in sole charge of 3 diamond claims, estimated to be worth around £5,000. The native labour required for this work was notoriously unreliable. Many natives, as soon as they were given a gun or anything else of value, they would simply set off back home and abandon their work. Cecil, however, didn't mind stripping off his shirt and getting down to work in the mines himself in such situations. This was obviously far from healthy for such a sickly man, and he also ended up breaking his little finger, which never properly set again. The whites were rather distasteful too, and Rhodes kept himself aloof from this bunch of shady characters. One contemporary from these days described Cecil, quote, "A tall, gaunt youth, roughly dressed, coated with dust, sitting moodily on a bucket, deaf to the chatter and rattle about him, his blue eyes fixed intently on his work or on some fabric of his brain." End quote. Cecil kept himself away from women, too. Louis Cohen later remarked, quote, "I do not believe if a flock of the most adorable women passed through the street, he would go across the road to see them. It is a fact that Rhodes was never seen to give the glad eye to a barmaid or tripping beauty, however succulent." End quote. Through overwork, Cecil quickly fell ill and suffered his first recorded heart attack. It was decided to take a few months' break, and the diamond claims were left in the hands of his trusted partners. Herbert had now since returned, and the two of them set off north. The trip was not only a convalescent one, however, as rumours of gold finds were beginning to drift in from the Transvaal. In the end, Cecil's health did improve, and he acquired his first property in the form of a 3,000-acre farm. In terms of gold, though, the trip was a disappointment. Soon enough, Herbert was off again, and began a 6-year-long series of wanderings, which ended in a ghastly accident as he was burnt to death in his hut in Nyasaland. At the end of July 1873, Rhodes set off for England, once again leaving the diamond claims in the hands of his much trusted friend, Charles Rudd. At 20 years old, Cecil was at last going to Oxford, as he had always wanted to. Of the Rhodes-Rudd partnership, Robert Rotberg writes in his biography of Cecil, quote, "Together they exerted a synergistic force greater than the mere sum of their efforts. Rhodes had ideas, enthusiasm, drive, and persistence. Rudd was steady and sure, a reliable executor of their money-making schemes, and, much later, a cautious steward of their growing wealth. Rhodes is often presumed to be the architect of their grand design, but the foundation stones may well have been put into place by Rudd." End quote. It was at Oxford that Rhodes received a much-needed intellectual stimulus, which helped him form his worldview. In his early diamond days, he'd quickly lost his faith, or at least most of it. If there were a god, he began to reason, then what was the most elevated ideal towards which he could strive? Surely it could not be money for money's sake, he thought, and so the answer was a kind of social trinity: justice, liberty, and peace. Journalist W.T. Stead said, quote, "Mr. Rhodes had no hesitation in arriving at the conclusion that the English race, the English-speaking man, whether British, American, Australian, or South African, is the type of race that does now, and is likely to continue to do in the future, the most practical, effective work to establish justice, to promote liberty, and to ensure peace over the widest possible area of the planet." End quote. His mission in life was decided. The Pax Romana was long since dead. It was time for Pax Britannica. The more of the world that were painted imperial red and civilized by the Anglo-Saxon race, the better, Cecil thought. A great inspiration for Rhodes was John Ruskin, who had once remarked, quote, "There is a destiny now possible to us, the highest ever set before a nation to be accepted or refused. Will you, youths of England, make your country again a royal throne of kings, a sceptred isle for all the world, a source of light, a centre of peace, a mistress of learning and of the arts, faithful guardian of time-tried principles? This is what England must either do or perish. She must found colonies as fast and as far as she is able, formed of her most energetic and worthiest men, seizing every piece of fruitful waste ground she can set her feet on, and there teaching those of her colonists that the chief virtue is to be fidelity to their country, and their first aim is to advance the power of England by land and sea. If we can get men for little pay to cast themselves against the cannon mouths for England, we may find men who will plough and sow for her, and will bring up their children to love her." End quote. For several generations of young British men, such a romantic call was irresistible. Cecil Rhodes was no exception. This time around, however, Rhodes would only remain at Oxford for one term. On the 1st of November, 1873, his mother died, and his own health was taking a dive. By early 1874, he was already back at the diggings. It was now that Rhodes's enterprise really began to snowball. Slowly, but surely, he was becoming a major player in the area, and not without the odd bit of controversy, such as when he was accused of bribery, but got off. Only in 1876 did Rhodes return to Oxford, and, once again, Rudd was left to keep expanding their operations. He wrote to Charles, quote, By all means, try and spare me for 2 years. You will find I shall be twice as good a speculator with the profession at my back." End quote. He did indeed end up being gone for the best part of the next 2 years, and his worldview continued to develop. On the 2nd of June, 1877, the same day that he was inducted into the Masonic Order, he wrote, quote, "It often strikes a man to inquire what is the chief good in life. To one, the thought comes that it is a happy marriage, to another great wealth, to a third, travel, and so on. As each seizes the idea, for that he more or less works for the rest of his existence. To myself, thinking over the same question, the wish came to render myself useful to my country." End quote. Rhodes seems to have become a Mason purely for networking purposes. He derided the devotion by a large body of men, quote, "to what at times appear the most ridiculous and absurd rites, without an object and without an end." End quote. When Rhodes returned on the 7th of August, 1877, he found a new world of opportunity awaiting him. The previous restrictions on Kimberley claims have been abandoned. The limit had previously been 10. Now those who had the capital were free to buy claims as they wished. The day of the small-time diggers was drawing to an end, and the future now belongs to the capitalists. Rhodes and Rudd, of course, were amongst the first to take advantage of this new free-for-all. At the height of this scramble, there was a chance to buy the entire De Beers mine for £6,000. Rhodes was forced to decline, however, as he simply couldn't afford it. Importantly at this time, Rhodes was deeply troubled by his own mortality after having suffered yet another heart attack. For this reason, he had a bizarre will and testament written up. The executor was the colonial secretary, Lord Carnarvon, who, in the event of Rhodes's death, was to use Rhodes's as yet unmade fortune to pursue the following quest. Quote, "The establishment, promotion, and development of a secret society, the true aim and object whereof shall be the extension of British rule throughout the world. The colonization by British subjects of all land where the means of livelihood are available by energy, labour, and enterprise, and especially the occupation by British settlers of the entire continent of Africa, the Holy Land, the valley of the Euphrates, the islands of Cyprus and Candia, the whole of South America, the islands of the Pacific not hitherto possessed by Great Britain, the whole of the Malay archipelago, the seaboard of China and Japan, the ultimate recovery of the United States of America as an integral part of the British Empire, the consolidation of the whole empire, the inauguration of a system of colonial representation in the imperial parliament, which may tend to weld together the disjointed members of the empire, and finally, the foundation of so great a power as to hereafter render wars impossible and promote the best interest of humanity." End quote. For this to ever take place, he needed that fortune, and so he and Rudd carried on building. By the beginning of 1880, the Rhodes-Rudd partnership was well established in the old De Beers mine, and on the 1st of April, they announced the formation of the De Beers Mining Company. There were other mining interests too. By the end of 1880, Rhodes was a director of the Lillenstein Mining Company. In January 1881, he became the director of the Kimberley Tramways Company, and his name appeared as a director of the International Diamond Mining Company. He and Rudd were also directors of the Kimberley Coal Mining Company. In October 1880, Griqualand West was incorporated into the Cape Colony, which meant that the area was now, of course, entitled to be represented in the Cape Assembly. Only 2 candidates presented themselves for the Berkeley seat, which was far less contested than the Kimberley seat. Rhodes was one of the 2, and he inevitably won out without much fuss. There was now, essentially, 2 Cecil Rhodeses. There was the diamond magnate, who was pulling in around £50,000 a year, a ridiculous sum for the time, and there was now Rhodes the politician. In Cape Town, he quickly made influential friends, and with his plans going forward, he was certainly going to need them. One of the issues of the day was that of Basuto land, modern-day Lesotho, and whether to disarm the Basutos. In his maiden speech, Rhodes just came right out and said that the territory should be taken over by Great Britain. He was promptly put on a commission alongside General Gordon, who later was to immortalize himself at Khartoum. The 2 got on fabulously well, but they couldn't really find a solution to Basutoland's problems. Unrest in the territory continued until Britain took it over in March 1884. One controversy that Rhodes found himself wrapped up in was that of the closed compound system and the Diamond Trade Act. African workers stealing diamonds had become an endemic problem, and ways were sought of stopping this. Prison-like enclosures were now set up for workers, and were designed to house black workers from the day they arrived until the day they left. Every precaution was taken to make sure that the Africans stopped stealing. After each shift, the Africans were made to strip naked, and then subjected to the probing of every orifice of their bodies. Many Africans swallowed the diamonds, and to deal with this, those who left the mines were confined to a tin hut in a nude condition and given castor oil. Here, they remained for 10 days, just to make sure. Rhodes did not invent this system, but he went along with it. In a report on the topic, quote, "As regard the system of trapping, Rhodes admitted that if one was to argue generally, that was a system which no one could approve of. But the circumstances were very exceptional, and it was only the great necessities of the community that impelled the sanction of the system. He would like anyone to show him any method or means whereby this crime could be checked, except by this exceptional and obnoxious system." End quote. Rhodes had very little actual interest in politics itself. All of it was merely part of the game he had to play in order to get at his actual goals in the name of his country and his race. The Rhodes of the 1880s would constantly lay out a map of Africa and point to the lands north of the Transvaal and up to Uganda. He would say to those around him, quote, "All this to be painted red. That is my dream." End quote. Of his people, he remarked, quote, "I contend that we are the finest race in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. Every acre added to our territory means in the future birth to some more of the English race." End quote. Rhodes remarked years later that he had read the history of other countries. Quote, "I saw that expansion was everything, and that, the world's surface being limited, the great object should be to take as much of it as we could." End quote. Leander Starr Jameson would remark of Rhodes's motives, quote, "He had, quote, formed the idea of doing a great work for the overcrowded British public at home by opening up fresh markets for their manufacturers." End quote. Rhodes, essentially, was espousing Lebensraum. The best way to do this, he thought, was for a great united South African state to be formed, which would be under British dominion. In this great journey north, the first domino was always going to be Bechuanaland, or modern-day Botswana. Rhodes immediately set his sights there. Quote, "I look upon this Bechuanaland territory as the Suez Canal of the trade of this country, the key of its road to the interior." End quote. Early on, Rhodes appealed for its incorporation into the empire, and he quite rightly suggested that if the Boers beat them to it, then some serious limits would be set on the future of the Cape. If this happened, then Britain would not be able to, quote, "spread its civilization over the interior." End quote. Quote, "I solemnly warn this House that if it departs from the control of the interior, we shall fall from the position of the paramount state in South Africa, which is our right in every scheme of federal union in the future, to that of a minor state." End quote. As if to announce his own future, Rhodes continued, quote, "The natives are bound gradually to come under the control of the Europeans. I feel that it is the duty of this colony, when, as it were, her younger and more fiery sons go out and take land, to follow in their steps with civilized government." End quote. On the 19th of March, 1884, the position of Treasurer of the Cape had opened up, and Thomas Canlan, the Prime Minister, offered it to Rhodes. The sky now, it seemed, might well be the limit. The opportunities were boundless. This, however, came to nothing. The Prime Minister resigned a few weeks later, and Rhodes lost his position. His next appointment, however, was an even better one. Cecil was to be appointed as Deputy Commissioner in Bechuanaland. The Boers had already set up two small republics here in 82 and 83. These were Stellaland and Goshen. In Stellaland, Rhodes met with Adrian de la Rey. Rhodes would recall of their meeting, quote, "I shall never forget our meeting. When I spoke to de la Rey, his answer was, 'Blood must flow,' to which I remember making the retort, 'Well, give me my breakfast, and then we can talk about blood.'" End quote. By the end of the week, he had become godfather to de la Rey's grandchild, and Stellaland was his. It wasn't as simple as that, as he had, of course, had to make concessions. But regardless, Rhodes got what he wanted. In Goshen, things were slightly more difficult. The Transvaal had proclaimed a protectorate, but had withdrawn when the British demanded that they do so. Regardless, Rhodes felt that this one needed a show of force. At Rhodes's request, in January 1885, Sir Charles Warren arrived in South Africa with 4,000 troops and headed for Bechuanaland. Here, Rhodes came face to face with President Kruger of the Transvaal. Kruger was double Rhodes's age, and Sir Charles Warren dominated the conversation. But regardless, Cecil left an impression. Kruger remarked, quote, "That young man will cause me trouble if he does not leave politics alone and turn to something else." End quote. All in all, things didn't work out the way Rhodes had hoped. He wanted part of Bechuanaland to be taken over by the Cape, but Warren wanted the whole lot annexed by Britain. Warren won out. Bechuanaland was divided into a crown colony and a British protectorate. Regardless, this would keep both the Boers and the Germans away. Rhodes could now focus on his other objectives. Politically, he was determined to bring about a federation of the four South African states. Cape Colony, the Transvaal, the Orange Free State, and Natal. Financially, he wanted to unify the four mines of Griqualand West: De Beers, Kimberley, De Toitspan, and Bultfontein. The former would give him a base for his future conquests. The latter would give him the money to achieve them. By the end of April 87, the last of the holdouts in De Beers had fallen. Rhodes' company now controlled the entire mine. The next obstacle was Kimberley, but here Rhodes met his match in the form of Barney Barnato, a tricky Jew who certainly wasn't lacking in chutzpah. Barnett Isaacs, for that was his real name, had exploded onto the scene and become Rhodes' foremost competitor. Privately, Cecil would admit that he feared the, quote, cunning little Jew, end quote. Soon enough, Barney had swallowed up most of the Kimberley mine and accomplished in little over a year what it had taken Rhodes 6 years to achieve. Whilst Barnato celebrated lavishly at the mine, Rhodes dashed off for England to try to steal the French company, the last company in Barney's way, from under his nose. The company had continued to grow, however, and Rhodes had no liquid capital in order to acquire it. His only choice, then, was to take out a loan. Alfred Beit, a Jewish ally of Rhodes's, suggested that Cecil should get in touch with Lord Rothschild. Immediately upon reaching England, this advice was taken, and a plan for buying the French company was discussed. Lord Rothschild was cautious, but ended the meeting with, quote, well, Mr. Rhodes, you go to Paris and see what you can do in reference to the purchase of the French company's property. And, in the meantime, I will see if I can raise the £1 million which you desire, end quote. This was good enough for Rhodes. After all, Lord Rothschild had recently advanced £4 million for the purchase of the Suez Canal. He was right to be optimistic. The French agreed to part with their company for £1.4 million. The sale had to be agreed at the shareholders' meeting in October, but this was seen as a formality. Barnato was up to date with Rhodes's moves by now and offered to pay $300,000 more than Rhodes was offering. Cecil's allies in Paris stood by him though, and Barnato was told that a provisional agreement had already been reached and that it was too late. Barney, slippery as ever, didn't care. He called a meeting of all the French company shareholders in Kimberley and won them over. A cable was sent off to Paris protesting the sale to Rhodes. By now, though, Rhodes had obviously made powerful allies. The Rothschilds' agents in Kimberley were put into play, and the situation became extremely complicated. After a highly publicized battle between Rhodes and Barnato, they eventually came to an agreement. De Beers ended up buying Kimberley Central, and the Barnato brothers themselves were eventually brought out for over £5 million a couple years later. The Rothschilds could easily have backed their fellow Jew, Barnato, instead, but Rhodes had blown them away with his charm, competence, and more than likely, his vision. On top of this, they were impressed by De Beers' technical competence, its comparative freedom from debt, and its ability to respond flexibly to new opportunities. Rhodes had long had his eye on the north, and he had, of course, already helped to secure Bechuanaland for the empire, which was a gigantic first step. The next step would be the lands of Lobengula, king of the Matabele tribe, and overlord of his vassals, most prominently the Mashona, to his east. Others, however, had the same idea, and this sprung Rhodes into action. In 1887, the Portuguese boldly issued a map which showed Lobengula's territory as a Portuguese possession. To the south, it was whispered that the Boers were about to proclaim a protectorate over the area, and to the west, the Germans weren't keeping their interest a secret either. The scramble for Africa had well and truly begun, and if the British, or rather Rhodes, didn't act now, then the region would never be painted imperial red. Cecil dashed off to Grahamstown in the Eastern Cape and burst into the office of Sir Hercules Robinson, the British High Commissioner. Rhodes demanded that the British beat the Transvaal to the punch and proclaim a protectorate over Lobengula's territory. Sir Hercules, however, was hesitant and unsure of how he would explain such a thing to the British government. Rhodes was not one to give up on something he had put his mind to, however, and he managed to drag a concession out of Sir Hercules. The British could not annex the territory or proclaim a protectorate just yet, but they could get an option on it. A dispatch was sent to Matabele land asking Lobengula not to enter into any treaty with a foreign power or part with any land without the sanction of the British High Commissioner. Lobengula agreed with the request. On the 11th of February, 1888, a treaty of peace and unity was signed between Lobengula and Victoria, the Great White Queen, in Lobengula's capital of Bulawayo. This was obviously far from perfect, but it was something, and it gave Rhodes the breathing space he needed to cook up one of his schemes. The Transvaal had been warned off, but now he had the concession hunters to deal with, and so his main objective became gaining mining concessions from the king. A month later, Rhodes' amalgamation with Barnato's Central Company was finally finalized. After arguing throughout the night, Rhodes got his way. He simply had to get things sorted so he could set about this whole Matabele business. Barney admitted defeat in the early morning. Quote, "Some people have a fancy for this thing and some for that. You have a fancy for making an empire. Well, I suppose I must give it to you." End quote. There, in a sparsely furnished Kimberley cottage, the future of not only the diamond industry, but of an entire continent was decided. The new amalgamation concern was called De Beers Consolidated Mines. Later, Barnata would recall, quote, "When you have been with him half an hour, you not only agree with him, but come to believe you have always held his opinion. No one else in the world could have induced me to go into this partnership. But Rhodes had an extraordinary ascendancy over men. He tied me up, as he ties everybody up. It is his way. You can't resist him. You must be with him." End quote. Throughout 1888 and 1889, Wolfenstein and Detroit span mines were also brought into Rhodes's web. In pulling off this whole ordeal, Rhodes had made plenty of enemies. About a quarter of the white workforce of Kimberley immediately became redundant, and between 25 and 50% of Africans suffered the same fate. Rhodes then added to this by dismissing 1,000 more workers. 2 days after this mass dismissal, a huge procession of white and coloured unemployed marched from the Deuterspan mine to the Kimberley mine with an effigy of Rhodes, which they then burned, saying, quote, "We now commit to the flames the last mortal remains of Cecil John Rhodes, Amalgamator General, Diamond King and Monarch of De Beers. Thank God, and in doing so, let us not forget to give 3 cheers for a traitor to his adopted country, panderer to the selfish greed of a few purse-proud speculators, and a public pest. May the Lord perish him. Amen." End quote. Rhodes, however, had a plan to absorb this white unemployment. The lands to the north were ripe for white settlement and exploitation. Regardless, he had his diamond monopoly. In 1888, Rhodes sat down to write the second will of his life. This one was as bizarre as the first. He left 2,000 De Beers shares to be split equally amongst his brothers and sisters, and the rest he gave to Lord Rothschild. Rhodes was then worth about £1 million, and the 2,000 De Beers shares represented an extremely minor part of his fortune. A letter was sent to Rothschild to accompany the will, which explained his decision. Cecil asked that his fortune be used to establish a society of the elect for the good of the empire. Quote, "In considering questions suggested, take Constitution Jesuits if obtainable, and insert English Empire for Roman Catholic religion." End quote. In other words, Rhodes wanted Rothschild to make a British Empire version of the Jesuits, which would be dedicated to furthering the empire and the Anglo-Saxon race. Rotberg writes in his biography of Rhodes, quote, "The grandiosity of the intent, as well as the simplicity of the method, must have impressed even one so cynical as Rothschild. By presuming to reduce complicated, even revolutionary propositions to their bare essentials, Rhodes may have enhanced his reputation as a visionary. To read his spare instructions today, even knowing their confused intellectual antecedents in Freemasonry, Reed's martyrdom, and Gladstonian liberalism, is to sense the ruminations and even fantasies of a madcap bumbler more than the outpourings of a shrewd mobilizer of ambition, avarice, and idealism." End quote. In the north, meanwhile, John Moffat was on a mission for Rhodes. John was a missionary like his father who had worked in Matabele land and was well placed to secure concessions on behalf of Britain. This he did, and a vague treaty was signed which essentially promised Lobengula nothing. The British, meanwhile, vaguely stated that they would give the Matabele British protection in return for mining concessions. The Boers immediately threw a fit and published their own previous treaty with Lobengula, and the Portuguese were equally as furious that the Mashona tribes, which they believed were under their jurisdiction, were described as merely Lobengula's vassals. Rhodes sensed the danger and dashed off to London. Here, he learned that 2 other companies, the Bechuanaland Exploration Company and the Exploring Company, had been working together to lobby Grandma, as Rhodes called the British government. They, too, wanted to exploit Matabele land, but were also meeting the same non-committal response. Time, evidently, was of the essence, and these companies were a far greater threat and could easily scuttle Rhodes's dreams. By the time Rhodes returned to South Africa, he had a vague plan. Sir Hercules Robinson recalled of their conversation after his return that he wanted a concession from Lobengula, quote, "of parts of Matabele land and Mashona land which are not in the use of the natives, and to provide for the protection of the natives in the parts reserved for them, as well as the development of the unoccupied territory surrendered to the company, by a royal charter somewhat similar to that granted some years ago to the Borneo Company." End quote. This plan was all very Sir Francis Drake. Rhodes, like so many heroes before him, was planning to set off into uncharted territory unofficially in the name of Britain. Sir Hercules gave Rhodes his backing. After all, if going north was inevitable anyway, why not let Rhodes stomach the cost? This was building the empire on the cheap. a proposition that was dear to the heart of many British politicians of that day. First of all, a small expedition was sent north to negotiate a more watertight mining concession. Charles Rudd, Francis Robert Thompson, and Rochford Maguire were the trio chosen for the task, and after 6 weeks, they arrived at Lobengula's kraal in his capital, Bulawayo. Rhodes said of his odds, quote, "Someone has to get the country, and I think we should have the best chance. I have always been afraid of the difficulty of dealing with the Matabele king. He is the only block to Central Africa, as once we have his territory, the rest is easy, as the rest is simply a village system with separate headmen, all independent of each other. I have faith in the country, and Africa is on the move. I think it is a second Cinderella," end quote. For weeks, the trio were to remain in limbo as the indecisive Lobengula made up his mind. The food was inedible, and the living conditions were primitive. The only few actual buildings in Bulawayo were built by Europeans. Worst of all, many of the Matabele seemed ready to kill the whites at a moment's notice. Thompson recalled, quote, "While I was in Matabele land, I saw many instances of ferocity and the most callous cruelty. I saw the most awful spectacle I've ever seen in my life. I saw, crawling on his hands and knees, a native, about 40 years old, with great lumps of flesh hanging from his face, his nose over his mouth, the ears both suspended by a thread of flesh. Just as I got near, I saw a man with a pole hit the crawling man in the small of the back, trying to kill the unfortunate brute. This was all in front of the king. The crime the man had committed was that while under the influence of liquor, he had drunk some of the king's beer. The king ordered his nose, ears, and lips, and the skin of his forehead to be cut off. Slaves were frequently brought in. 2 girls, aged 12 and 14, were at the king's kraal. The poor creatures took it in their heads to make a bolt for it and tried to get home. Young warriors, about 20 years old, were sent after them, and they were caught near Imshanyani, almost dead from hunger. They were brought back, fed for a day, and then thrashed by the dog, 20 boys, aged from 12 to 18 years. A native named Kamalo, whom I knew well, was sentenced to be stoned to death for witchcraft. Hundreds of men were killed in this and other ways. The king suffered from gout, and his doctors put it into his head that the only way to be cured was to smell out natives and kill them. The king, unfortunately, had attacks of gout frequently, end quote. By chance, in the middle of October, Sir Sidney Shippard, the commissioner of Bechuanaland, appeared in Bulawayo. The entire way he had been provoked endlessly by random hordes of natives, but his men had held their nerve. The king, time after time, had to tell his restive impis that under no circumstances could they attack the whites. Their solution to this was to attempt to provoke the whites first. Thankfully, the whites' impulse control held, and no such incident occurred. Regardless, Shippard's appearance proved immensely helpful, and soon enough, Lobengula was ready to talk. Shippard's attitude to the Matabele was hardly a secret. Of them he said, quote, "I must confess that it would offer me sincere and lasting satisfaction if I could see the Matabele cut down by our rifles and machine guns like a cornfield by a reaping machine. The cup of their iniquities must surely be full, or nearly full by now," end quote. On the 30th of October, Lobengula, who could neither read nor write, signed his kingdom away. Rhodes was handed over, quote, "the complete and exclusive charge over all metals and minerals situated and contained in my kingdom's principalities and dominions, together with full power to do all things that they may deem necessary to win and procure the same, and to hold, collect, and enjoy the profits and revenue from metals and minerals," end quote. In return, the king was to be paid £100 per month, and he was to be supplied with 1,000 Martini Henry rifles and 100,000 cartridges. He was also promised an armed steamboat on the Zambezi, but this was never delivered. Brian Roberts writes in Cecil Rhodes' Flawed Colossus, quote, "It was to prove an even greater turning point in the life of Lobengula. That the king appreciated the significance of the document he signed is extremely doubtful. Charles Helm explained to him the wording of the concession, but he could never have spelt out its implications. As far as can be judged, Lobengula was under the impression that the white man would dig their holes, extract their gold, and that he would be left undisturbed. An end would be put to the constant stream of petitioners to his kraal, and he would be free to rule his subjects as he had always done. He is even reported to have expressed the wish that not more than 10 men would come and dig as a result of the concession. How wrong he was, but he realized his mistake too late," end quote. As soon as Rudd got to Cape Town and met Rhodes, the latter took it right to Sir Hercules Robinson, who was strongly in favour of having it published. Rhodes, however, considered certain conditions not fit for public consumption. Rhodes was essentially arming a tyrannical savage king with 1,000 rifles. To many, this quite rightly would have been seen as a direct threat to white supremacy in South Africa. To avert political chaos, Rudd cooked up a discreetly worded version of the concession, and with the approval of Rhodes and Robinson, he had it published in the Cape Press. On the 24th of November, 1888, there was no mention of the rifles. In general, Rhodes was absolutely jubilant. He exclaimed, quote, "Our concession is so gigantic, it is like giving a man the whole of Australia," end quote. Cecil now had one task and one task only, and that was to achieve a royal charter. His enemies, meanwhile, rushed to Bulawayo with the newspaper clippings and began to try and convince Lobengula that he had been deceived. He had just given away his whole country for nothing, they told him. The mineral concessions were merely a pretext. This left Thompson, who was still in Bulawayo, in an extremely precarious situation. Rhodes's rivals in Bulawayo convinced Lobengula to send 2 emissaries to meet the Queen in London. There, they could find out who she was really sending on behalf of her. Off they went, and they were to be gone for nearly a year. Back in London, however, George Causton and Lord Gifford were having second thoughts since failing to get any government backing for their own enterprise. In January 1889, a telegraph was sent off to Rhodes, suggesting an amalgamation, a language Rhodes definitely understood. Lieutenant Mound, the agent of Causton and Gifford who was joining the natives, was swiftly converted from an adversary to an ally. He was allowed to leave Cape Town with the 2 natives. Now, they would be used to help Rhodes's cause, not hinder it. Rhodes, too, sailed for England shortly after the other trio set off. Upon arrival, the Africans were given the usual festivities given to African dignitaries and were taken to see the Queen. There was to be no meeting, only an exchange of pleasantries and gifts. Rhodes had beaten Lobengula to the punch. To get his royal charter, meanwhile, Rhodes set off about London trying to convince anyone with influence via whatever means necessary. At this time, Rhodes was a rather unknown figure in Britain. Lord Salisbury, the PM, referred to him as, quote, "rather a pro-Boer MP in South Africa," end quote. Joseph Chamberlain, meanwhile, was convinced that he was an anti-imperialist and referred to him as an Afrikaner. Regardless, Rhodes knew what he wanted, and he knew how to get it. Salisbury hinted that the public would feel more reassured if the new company had men of social standing amongst its directors, and so Rhodes took the hint and found just such people in the form of 2 dukes and the heir to an earldom. On the 29th of October, 1889, the charter was signed by Queen Victoria. In most regards, Rhodes got what he wanted with the British South Africa Company, as it was called. He had tried to have Bechuanaland placed within its grasp, but failed. Other than this, though, Rhodes was given free rein to the north with no fixed boundary. The BSAC had been given a free hand to the heart of Africa. Rhodes was free to form a police force, enter into treaties, acquire further concessions, and exercise, quote, "powers necessary for the purpose of government and the preservation of public order in or for the protection," end quote, of the territories they controlled. Very few restrictions were placed on the company. They were to abolish the slave trade, limit the sale of liquor to Africans, respect local customs, and refrain from interfering with indigenous religion, quote, "except so far as may be necessary in the interests of humanity," end quote. For now, however, Lobengula had to be given his guns so that he wouldn't have any more sudden changes of heart. This was, of course, a matter that had to be handled with the utmost discretion. Rhodes himself obviously couldn't go, and so it was left to Dr. Jameson, a man whom Rhodes had actually been living with for the past 2 years. This was a bizarre assignment for a man who had no taste for exploring the wilds, but he was bright, daring, and loyal enough to make it work. Lobengula, however, was an erratic king, terrified of losing his kingdom. Day by day, he began to regret his decision more and more, and in September, he called a meeting of his indunas, his headmen. Here, Lotche, the most important induna in the land, who was associated with the concession, was sentenced to death. This sentence was promptly carried out, and was followed up by wholesale slaughter as his wives, kinsmen, and all of the dependents were rounded up and butchered. The death toll was said to be over 300. Even Lobengula wasn't best pleased at what had taken place, but the other bloodthirsty indunas had simply made a slaughter inevitable. Thompson wasn't present when all this took place, but out on the road, an African approached him and said, quote, "Thomason, the king says the killing of last night is not over yet," end quote. Thompson quite rightly took the hint and fled Matabeleland. After weeks of dodging lions and nearly dying of thirst, he reached Mafeking, where he sent a wire to Rhodes. Cecil promptly dispatched Dr. Jameson and 2 companions to meet Thompson, who, after a lot of persuading, agreed to join them on their trip to Bulawayo to make things right. The morbidly obese king, thankfully, was in poor health. Dr. Jameson seemed to be in just the right place at the right time, and soon enough, freed from pain and flattered by Jameson's banter, Lobengula was coaxed out of his sulk. For the next 4 months, Jameson would remain in Bulawayo and attempted to break down more and more of Lobengula's barriers to clear the way for an occupation of Matabeleland. Back down in South Africa, the chartered company was recruiting pioneers to do just that. Whilst Jameson was still present in the Matabele capital, Lobengula had another group of visitors. This was 4 soldiers from the Royal Horse Guards in their tight scarlet tunics, sporting top boots, brass breastplates, and helmets. Matabeleland had never seen such magnificence before. Regardless, the 4 of them were there in the sweltering African heat on behalf of Queen Victoria. With them was the Queen's response to Lobengula's letter, which his indunas had taken to her in London. Before it was delivered to Lobengula, the letter was shown to Jameson, who promptly tore it up and, quote, rewrote it in a style calculated to please a savage monarch, end quote. This new letter gave the Queen's blessing to Rhodes and the chartered company, and, for good measure, warned the king against possible Portuguese or Boer incursions. By destroying an official royal communication, Dr. Jameson was showing who really ran the show in Central Africa. The king was greatly impressed by the soldiers, and seeing their new letter had quite an effect on him. A few days after the 4 of them left, Jameson once more approached Lobengula. The doctor told the king that his diggers had failed to find gold, and that they were hesitant to move further north. Lobengula suggested that they try somewhere else. Jameson pointed vaguely towards Mashonaland to the east, and the king offered no objections. Jameson then produced a map and showed the route which Rhodes's column planned to take. Once more, the king offered no objections, and so Dr. Jameson promptly set off south to meet with Rhodes. Cecil had certainly been busy. He had set about extending the railway line from Kimberley to the Matabele border and had begun assembling his team. For this team, Rhodes wanted men, if possible, who were from influential families in the Cape. If anything were to go wrong, then these men could call upon their influential fathers to get a bailout from the British government. Aside from these types, the usual artisans, tradesmen, butchers, bakers, builders, blacksmiths, and all the rest were needed. All volunteers would be paid 7 shillings and 6 pence a day while on the march, and upon arrival they would be granted 3,000 acres of farmland and 15 gold claims. The column was to be entirely male, and preferably unmarried, for Rhodes hated working with married men. To equip this force, Rhodes approached Colonel Sir Frederick Carrington of the Bechuanaland Police. The given quote, however, was simply far too high. Instead, Rhodes turned to a random 23-year-old man named Frank Johnson, who he had just happened to come across at the Kimberley Club. Cecil simply walked up to the boy, appeared to recognize him, sat down, and ordered bacon and eggs without even saying good morning. Rhodes asked Johnson what he thought of Colonel Carrington's estimate of 2,500 men. The boy replied, quote, 2,500 men? Absurd, end quote. Johnson claimed he could do it with 250 men. Rhodes immediately replied asking if he meant that in a serious manner, to which Frank was somewhat taken aback. 250 had simply been thrown out as an automatic reduction of 2,500. Regardless, he said yes rather than admitting he was bluffing. The two then sat down for hours and figured out how much the whole ordeal would cost. The result was £87,000, a far cry from the £1 million which Carrington had quoted. Frank Johnson was then offered to lead the expedition, but amazingly, he refused. Despite Rhodes throwing a tantrum, the boy left for Cape Town that evening. Cecil Rhodes, however, was not a man to take no for an answer. He set off for Cape Town himself, found Johnson, and tried bribery, flattery, appeals to duty, and just about every trick in the book to get Johnson to take the job. In the end, he got his way. Slowly but surely, the column began to come together over the next few months, and Frederick Selous, the famous hunter, was tasked with finding the most appropriate route. In terms of general volunteers, there was no shortage, as news of the expedition fired the imaginations of adventurous and impoverished youngsters all throughout South Africa. Rhodes and Johnson almost immediately fell out when it came to who to pick. Johnson chose men for what they could offer. Rhodes wanted men based on who their fathers were. Rhodes once summoned Johnson and demanded, quote, "What is this I have heard that you have refused to take so-and-so? I have promised he shall go, and you must take him," end quote. Johnson had to calmly explain that if he took all of these extra men purely based on their families, then Rhodes would have to pay for it. After calming down, Cecil agreed to meet all the extra costs and handed Johnson a list of men that he wanted personally chosen. By the 27th of June, 1890, all was ready and the column set off. Ahead of them was Selous and a small advance party who cut and cleared the road. It was an uneasy journey. Jameson, and essentially Jameson alone, was certain that the Matabele would not attack the column. Everybody else laid in the laager each night, fully expecting they might be awoken by a raid. As it turned out, Jameson was correct. Eventually the column broke out into the plains of Mashonaland. Jameson wrote, quote, Here, we are in the midst of the grandest scenery I have ever seen. A mass of granite and larger forest. The dense underwood almost disappeared. The end of September ought to see us at the objective point." End quote. On the 12th of September, they did indeed arrive, and the column camped on the plain beneath Mount Hampton. At 10 a.m. the following morning, the men were paraded in full dress, the Union Jack was raised, prayers were offered, and a 21-gun salute was fired. The country was then casually annexed, and the company gave 3 cheers for the Queen. The name chosen for this new settlement was Fort Salisbury, named of course after Lord Salisbury, the Prime Minister. An express letter was sent to Rhodes, who later recalled, quote, "When at last I found they were through to Fort Salisbury, I do not think there was a happier man in the country than myself." End quote. Rhodes desperately wanted to accompany the pioneer column, but he was, of course, needed elsewhere in the Cape. The need for easy communication with the North, then, was of the utmost importance to him. He once said, quote, "The railway is my right hand, and the telegraph my voice." End quote. Since his return from England in 1889, Cecil had essentially ignored his parliamentary duties as the member for Berkeley West. In May 1890, however, he was forced to rush to Cape Town by a crisis. The Prime Minister sought to construct railway lines in the south to connect the more isolated regions of the colony. This would have cost the taxpayer £7.5 million, and Rhodes, obsessed as he was with railway construction taking place in the north, was in no mood to let that happen. Rhodes, together with the Afrikaner Bond, the largest single group in Parliament, managed to scupper Prime Minister Sir Gordon Spriggs' plans. Rhodes did not just stop here. He now began a full-scale assault upon the PM, and after a particularly stormy debate on the 10th of July, Spriggs was forced to admit defeat, and he resigned. Sir Henry Locke, as Governor of the Cape, was left with the task of finding a new Prime Minister. Others were approached first, but they all recommended Rhodes. Rhodes himself didn't even have his eye on the premiership, and he would later claim that he had been forced into it. On one occasion, he said, quote, "They want me to be Premier, but I have not the time. Being much occupied with the North, I have made up my mind not to attend Parliament, but I found there was a huge railway bill proposed, and I thought it was my duty to oppose it, as it would place too great a burden upon the revenue of this country." End quote. His purpose in bringing down Spriggs was simply to secure the northward extension of the railway line, and his interest in Cape politics was now once again diminished. Regardless, he was offered the premiership by Locke. At first, Cecil suggested someone else, but ultimately he was forced to accept the position. 2 weeks after his pioneer column had set off from Mashonaland, Cecil Rhodes was officially installed as Prime Minister of the Cape. Rhodes said to a Congress of the Bond, which had brought him to power in 1891, quote, "For nearly 9 years, I have voted and worked with your party, for the simple reason that I looked upon that party as representing the people of the country. I did so with no ultimate hope that one day you would hoist me into power, but simply feeling that that was the proper policy and the proper politics to pursue in the Cape Parliament." End quote. Up until now, Rhodes had lived a rough life in tin-roofed cottages in Kimberley. Meals were eaten at the Kimberley Club, and his only servant was Tony de la Cruz, a coloured man from Portuguese East Africa. For the first time since arriving in Africa, it was time for Cecil to find a more appropriate home in the form of an old 2-storied house on the outskirts of Cape Town. At first, he was a tenant, but after 2 years, he purchased it and had an architect restore it to its previous state. That, and when it was a granary for the Dutch East India Company. Quote, "Make it big and simple, barbaric if you like. I'm told my ideas are too big. They would be if I were living in St. Helena or Cyprus, but we are living on the fringe of a continent." End quote. Soon enough, the building, now named Gros de Chaux, aka Great Granary, became one of the show places of the Cape and one of the few personal possessions which Rhodes actually cherished. Herbert Baker, the architect, quickly became one of the leading architects of his day afterwards. There was hardly an important visitor to South Africa who did not stay at Gros de Chaux over the next few years. This, obviously, improved Rhodes' reputation, which he was by now acquiring, and this was further confirmed in the early months of 1891 when he paid a triumphant visit to England. It was not an obscure colonial financier like last time we stepped onto English shores, but rather Prime Minister of the Cape and a hero of the Empire. He admitted on his return, quote, "Oh yes, they have made a Buffalo Bill of me for 30 days, end quote. The highlight of the visit was an invitation to dine and sleep at Windsor as Queen Victoria's guest. Rhodes had no court dress and no idea of what he should wear, which caused somewhat of a domestic crisis. A Bond Street tailor had to be summoned, and it wasn't until a few minutes before Rhodes's train was due to leave Paddington Station that a messenger arrived with a suitcase containing an appropriate wardrobe. Little is known of Cecil's conversations with the Queen. At one stage, she asked him about his activities in Africa, to which Rhodes responded, quote, "I am doing my best to enlarge your majesty's dominions," end quote. Queen Victoria also asked Rhodes if it was true that he was a woman hater. Rhodes evasively responded, quote, "How can I hate a sex to which your majesty belongs?" end quote. Rhodes was somewhat of an asexual before his time. If anything, he had a repressed liking for youthful-looking young men in their 20s. It's almost certain, if not guaranteed, that he didn't do anything sexual with these types who he liked to keep around, but keep them around, he did. When it came to women in this regard, it was all very strange. Harry Curry, his private secretary, who accompanied him on the London trip, is but one example. A few months after returning to Cape Town, Curry became engaged. Eventually, Curry plucked up the courage to tell Rhodes, and then all hell broke loose. Rhodes began to storm up and down the room, screaming, quote, leave my house, end quote. Only after a few days did he calm down and go to Curry's office for a chat. Curry recalls that Rhodes said, quote, "We only live once, and that, if one met a nice girl who could be a friend and a companion, it was the right thing to try and marry her." For himself, he said that he would miss me very much, that we always got on exceedingly well, and that had I not proposed to get married, we would doubtless have continued to live together until one or other of us died. He did not know or care whom he would get to succeed me, end quote. At the wedding, the guest of honor, Cecil Rhodes, straight up to the nervous bride and announced, quote, "I am very jealous of you," end quote. Back in the world of politics, Rhodes formed what was popularly known as the Ministry of All Talents. In fact, the cabinet was an incredibly uneasy alliance. The first crack formed in March 1891. The divisive issue was the Masters and Servants Act, which was introduced by an Afrikaner Bond member. This was commonly known as the Strop Bill, or the more graphic, every man to wallop his own N-word bill. The idea was that the Cape would be brought into line with the neighbouring states in regards to corporal punishment of black labourers. The Afrikaner Bond had long angled for such measures, whereas the more liberal types, almost always Anglos, tended to feel the opposite way. Rhodes came out firmly on the side of the floggers. Early in his career, he had stated, quote, "Treat the natives as a subject people, as long as they continue in a state of barbarism. Be lords over them, and let them be a subject race," end quote. Even the support of the PM was not enough to carry this bill through, however, and it was withdrawn in June. Somehow, Rhodes managed to keep his cabinet intact, but he lost a lot of liberal sympathy in the process. Of Rhodes's behaviour in Parliament in general, George Wilson of the Cape Times would recall, quote, "His general behaviour really always struck me as being that of a large, overgrown schoolboy, particularly in debate. He would spring to his feet, deliver a sudden and unexpected attack on some honourable member opposite, and then sit down again on his hands and bounce up and down for some seconds, as if he was saying, 'There's one for you, old boy,' chuckling enormously as he did so." Another favourite attitude of his was to extend at full length on the Prime Minister's bench and apparently go to sleep. At any critical moment, however, he would open one eye and look searchingly at whoever might be attacking him, end quote. By allying himself with the Afrikaner Bond, Rhodes proved much more able to work with the Boer republics than his predecessors. He had little difficulty, for example, in arranging with the Orange Free State for an extension of the railway to the Transvaal border. Continuing the line through President Paul Kruger's lands in the Transvaal, however, proved much harder. Kruger was extremely reluctant to fall in with Rhodes's plans for a South African customs and railway union, and instead sought to secure his country's independence by going east via Portuguese East Africa. Another issue when it came to a united South Africa was the lack of a common native policy. In this regard, the Cape was the odd man out. In the Boer republics and Natal, voting was restricted to white adult males. In the Cape, however, any man could vote so long as he owned property valued at £25 or earned over £50 a year. Rhodes, together with the Bond, no doubt sought to reform the Cape's voting policy to be more in line with the other republics. This, too, caught another crisis. Rhodes did not seek to deprive coloured citizens of the vote, but he instead sought to raise the voting qualifications. In the end, a compromise was reached. The property qualifications were raised from £25 to £75, and an elementary literacy test was introduced in which voters had to be able to write their name, address, and occupation. Thanks to this reform, 3,348 coloured citizens were disenfranchised within a year, whereas the number of white voters increased by 4,506. This didn't quite bring the Cape into line with her more racially conscious neighbours, but it was certainly a move in that direction. It was not a racial issue in the end that brought down Rhodes's first ministry, but rather what became known as the Logan scandal. This wasn't particularly Rhodes's fault, but it caught him unawares. The day before Rhodes and James Siverite sailed for England in October 1892, Sivrite awarded a 15 or more year monopoly contract on railway catering and refreshment rooms. This was done without all of the customary procedures, and the recipient was James Logan, an intimate friend and fellow Scot. Rhodes didn't seem to realise the seriousness of the backlash while he was in London. He didn't get back until March 1893 and travelled via Egypt and the east coast of Africa en route. Sivrite returned on the 24th of April, and demands were made for an explanation. If this wasn't delivered, 3 important cabinet members said, then they would resign. Rhodes was left in a very tricky position and sought advice from Jan Hofmeyr, the Bond leader, who simply told him to resign and form a new ministry. This was done, and there was a new election in 1894. Rhodes and his supporters won 2/3 of the parliamentary seats. Whilst Rhodes had been busy in Parliament, the company itself had, of course, been busy. North of the Zambezi, so modern-day Zambia, had now since fallen into the company's lap. With the help of Francois Collard, a French Protestant missionary, Lewanika, king of the Lozi people, had been persuaded to accept a British protectorate, and he granted the company mineral rights in the form of the Lochner concession, which was far further reaching than the Rudd concession, which Lobengula had signed. Rhodes had no plans for large-scale white settlement like he had south of the Zambezi in what was to become southern Rhodesia. In what was to become northern Rhodesia, the company had an exclusive monopoly to find and mine precious metals. Settlement was essentially limited to whatever was required for the task. In return, Lewanika was paid £2,000 a year, and the company pledged to defend his people from attack. On top of this, the company was to assist in the efforts of Christian missions, help build schools, foster trade, and arrange a postal and telegraph service. Essentially, Lewanika had parted with his nation's minerals for £2,000 a year and civilization itself being brought to his lands. Of the company's lands above the Zambezi, Rotberg writes, quote, "What neither Collard nor Lewanika nor even Lochner could have anticipated nor altered was Rhodes's, and therefore the company's, profound disinterest in this part of Trans-Zambesia. Once the mineral prospects were realized to be poor, and the terrain and climate likewise, Rhodes naturally preferred to spend the company's hard-won funds in more immediately productive places. Lewanika's powerlessness was patent. It was only obvious long after the fact that Rhodes had merely acquired an option of a Boretsi land to hold German and Portuguese territorial ambitions at bay, and, in case it possessed greater promise than he had thought, to prevent others from taking it." End quote. Besides, what would become southern Rhodesia was giving him enough trouble. Employing 650 company policemen was costing a lot of money. Transport expenses and the stocks of relief food that had to be hurried to Salisbury in early 1891 added to the company's burden, and financial anxiety too. Rhodes said of that year, quote, "After tremendous efforts, I have thrown into the country about 500 wagon loads of goods, and, with good fortune, may just be able to save the population of 2,000 whites from starving during the next summer when all transport is closed down." End quote. Within a year, Cecil Rhodes had spent £700,000 on his land south of the Zambezi. Only by the end of 1891 did Rhodes get a little more economical. Police numbers were slashed to 100, and a force of local volunteers was raised instead. Admin and transport expenditures were also cut. By mid-1891, Mashonaland was beginning to be called a new name. Originally, the settlers' weekly newspaper had been called the Mashonaland Herald, and then the Zambezian Times. By late October, however, it was known as the Rhodesia Herald. 2 months earlier, Rhodes had told a friend with pride that, quote, "They are calling the new country Rhodesia. That is from the Transvaal to the south end of Tanganyika. The other name is Zambezia." End quote. It wouldn't be until 1895 that the name was in steady use, however, and only in 1897 did Rhodesia become the official title. Regardless, Rhodes stated, quote, "Well, you know, to have a bit of country named after one is one of the things a man might be proud of." End quote. The man chosen to administer Mashonaland was Dr. Jameson, and he proved to be incredibly popular with the pioneers. Frederick Selous said of the man, quote, "Dr. Jameson has endeared himself to all classes of the community by his tact and good temper, and has managed all the diverse details connected with the administration of a new country with the correctness of judgment which amounts to nothing less than genius, and genius of a most rare and versatile order. He was the man for the position." End quote. This praise was perhaps a little excessive, but regardless, he was indeed well liked. Jameson was totally inexperienced, hot-headed, and far too easily swayed to be the ideal candidate. He was obviously only chosen for his friendship with Rhodes, and he was given quite the task. Jameson was tasked with reforming the economy, soothing the pioneers, and establishing law and order. All of this whilst keeping an eye on the neighbouring savage Matabele, who were always itching for a fight. Despite their claim to be the protectors of the Mashona, The company was unable to stop constant Matabele raids into Mashonaland, in which they slaughtered or enslaved the locals. This caused absolute havoc when it came to developing the colony. Even the slightest hint of a Matabele impi arriving would send the settlers' Mashona workforce fleeing for the hills, and they wouldn't return for weeks. Jameson sent off complaints to Lobengula, but it made no difference. The Mashona workforce was vital for the settlers' economy, but by the same token, Lobengula's economy also relied upon raiding and enslaving the Mashona. It was a problem to which there was no peaceful solution. War with Lobengula seemed inevitable, and many of the settlers were itching to give it a go. Jameson, whilst also recognizing the inevitability, was in no rush. Quote, "From a financial point of view, it would throw the country back till God knows when," end quote. Regardless, for now he saw no imminent danger. He declared in late 1892, quote, "We are on the most friendly terms with Lobengula. I have not the least fear of any trouble in the future from Lobengula," end quote. This, however, was out of Jameson's hands. In June 1893, a Mashona clan stole some cattle from some tributaries of Lobengula. As expected, Lobengula sent an impi across the vague border after them. Here, the impi was intercepted by a certain Captain Lendy and ordered to return to Matabeleland. Lobengula was left humiliated and decided to double down and sent a far larger force of 3,500 men to reclaim his cattle and avenge the insult. The impi was ordered not to bring back captives, but to, quote, "sweep them off the face of the earth," end quote. Letters were dictated and sent to Jameson and Lendy, explaining the reasoning for the raid and promising that no whites would be harmed. These, however, did not arrive until after the attack. The impi marched into Mashonaland and caused panic amongst blacks and whites alike, which caused a stampede to descend upon Fort Victoria as both races sought shelter. Despite Lobengula's instructions, a number of farms and mission stations were surrounded and had their property destroyed and cattle seized. The Mashona labourers were slaughtered in front of their terrified white employers. As the horde reached Fort Victoria, they demanded that all of the Shona refugees be handed over. Out of courtesy, they said, they would make sure to execute the Mashona down in the bush away from the river so as not to pollute the water. This request was refused by Captain Lendy, and he sent for Jameson, who arrived on the 17th of July. Here, Jameson took his stand. If the Matabele did not back off within an hour, then they'd be driven out by force. Jameson remarked, quote, "I intend to treat them like dogs and order the whole impi out of the country. Then, if they do not go, send Lendy out with 50 mounted men to fire into them," end quote. Lendy duly followed the blacks as they withdrew, and upon discovering that the Matabele had plundered and burnt down 2 Mashona kraals en route, he launched an attack in which 10 warriors were killed. There was no resistance. The impi fled for their lives. Upon finding out about this so-called Victoria incident, Jameson telegraphed Rhodes, who wired back, quote, "Read Luke 14:31, end quote. This passage of the Bible reads, quote, "Or what king, going to make war against another king, sitteth not down first, and consulteth whether he be able with 10,000 to meet him that cometh against him with 20,000, end quote. Sanctioned by Holy Writ, the preparations for war went ahead, and there was no difficulty in raising volunteers. An agreement was signed on the 14th of August, which promised that recruits would be rewarded with a 6,000-acre farm, 20 gold claims, and a share of the looted cattle. Rhodes personally agreed to meet any additional expenses by selling 50,000 chartered shares. 2 months later, the invasion began. The war, which falls more in the scope of my Rhodesia video than my Rhodes video, was hardly a war at all. Jameson moved out in the middle of October, and by the 4th of November, the white man was standing in Lobengula's ruined and deserted capital. It had been a complete walkover, and the savages were no match for the Maxim gun at both Shangani and Bembezi. Rhodes had by now set off for his colony, and Lobengula was fleeing north, pursued every step of the way by Alan Wilson, Frederick Burnham, and their boys. A small column led by Wilson was eventually surrounded, and they went down fighting while singing God Save the Queen. This small victory, however, could not change the course of the war. Lobengula died shortly afterwards, many said of a broken heart. On the 19th of December, Cecil Rhodes addressed his disbanded troops at Bulawayo, and the European settlement of the former Matabele capital then began. The natives were shunted into outlying, badly watered lands and left to get on with their lives, whilst the settlers set about bringing civilization. Rhodes was not against native involvement, of course, but there was a clear case of conqueror and conquered. Quote, "If any of them show intelligence or capacity to acquire property of their own, they certainly should not be barred from doing so. But then, I think they should be treated as ordinary citizens," end quote. Matabeleland was not to be the only conquest of Rhodes's during these years. He attempted to annex Bechuanaland from the imperial government, but to no avail. Afterwards, he raged, quote, "It is humiliating to be utterly beaten by these N-words. They think more of one native at home than the whole of South Africa," end quote. He also offered to administer Uganda, but this, too, was denied. Elsewhere, he had more luck. Pondoland, a tribal territory which had long caused trouble for the Cape, was finally annexed as the local chief signed the deed of submission on the 17th of March, 1894. Rhodes paid a hasty visit to the territory 3 weeks later. It was later that same year that Rhodes paid another lightning visit to his promised land of Rhodesia. Dr. Harris, the secretary of the chartered company, did not have much positive to say of the colony. Accompanying Rhodes was John Hayes Hammond, a highly respected American mining expert. If, Harris said, quote, "We have to depend on Hammond's geological report to raise money for this country, I do not think the outlook is encouraging. For, if he cannot say anything stronger than that, I have not much hope for the future of the chartered company," end quote. Hammond's advice was needed elsewhere too. He had come to know most of the outlander, or rather non-Boer European population of the Transvaal. There had been heavy restrictions placed upon their mining activities, despite their ever-growing population, as they flooded in to exploit the Witwatersrand gold mine. Hammond said to Rhodes, quote, "Unless a radical change is made, there will be a rising of the people in Johannesburg," end quote. It's unclear whether this was the first time Rhodes had entertained getting involved in a Transvaal coup, but regardless, it certainly sent him further down that path. Rhodes and Jameson visited England in November 1894, and there was hardly a newspaper that did not hail their arrival or record their movements. Wherever they went, they were granted a hero's welcome. Jameson was feted just as much as Rhodes was, given that he was now the conqueror of Matabeleland. The duo were invited to stay with the Queen at Windsor Castle, where Rhodes was made a Privy Councillor, and Jameson was made a commander of the Bath. The entire visit was one of mutual backslapping, and has often been viewed as the peak of Rhodes's career. He and Jameson alike had become imperial heroes. At a meeting at the Imperial Institute, in which the Prince of Wales and Rhodes were sat next to him, Jameson proudly proclaimed that the company had annexed, quote, "a country as large as Europe, where white men and women can live, where children can be reared in health and vigor," end quote. He saw this as the start of even greater things, the beginnings of, quote, "a commercial union of the different states of South Africa," end quote. Eventually, Jameson boldly claimed, even the Boers would see sense and join this greater South African project. The Transvaal, he said, had 50,000 Englishmen, and pointed out, quote, "Surely even the Transvaal, with its 15,000 Boers and Mr. Paul Kruger, will within a reasonable time see reason, and join in this much-to-be-desired union of the South African states," end quote. It was true that the outlanders of the Transvaal were disaffected. In 1892, they had formed the National Union and campaigned for their rights. This had failed to move the stubborn old Transvaal president, Paul Kruger. As a boy, Kruger had trekked north from the Cape with his parents to escape the British, and he saw himself as the guardian of his people. The Transvaal, he quite rightly thought, was for the Boers. Once upon a time, he remarked to the outlanders' demands as he pointed to his flag, quote, "You see that flag? If I grant the franchise, I may as well pull it down," end quote. Regardless of Kruger's noble intentions, he was in an unwinnable situation. Plots were being formed to deprive him of his country. It was rumoured everywhere that the outlanders were ready to rise up and take command of the country in which they were the majority. This rising, assisted by an armed force near the Transvaal border, would be quite enough to topple Kruger's government. The outlanders themselves were mostly businessmen and miners, and would be little match for the Boers. The armed force, then, was vital. This, at least, was the plot that was coming to fruition. Plans were being made in the other direction too. Paul Kruger had attended a banquet in Pretoria in honour of the Kaiser's birthday, and the old president made a speech. He spoke highly of his visit to the Kaiser once upon a time, and then praised the loyalty of his German subjects before going on, quote, "I know I may count on the Germans in future. I feel certain that when the time comes for the Republic to wear larger clothes, you will have done much to bring it about. The time is coming for our friendship to be more firmly established than ever," end quote. When Rhodes heard about this, the implications were not lost on him. The last thing he wanted was the Germans sniffing around and ruining his grand plans. In June 1895, the Liberal government fell, and Joseph Chamberlain became Colonial Secretary. This gave Rhodes renewed hope, and he once more requested that Bechuanaland be transferred to him. This was vital if his men were to have a jumping-off point, and so off went Dr. Harris as Rhodes's negotiator. The excuse given was that the Cape and Rhodesian railways should be linked up, but Chamberlain and Harris's talks went much further than that. There is little doubt that Chamberlain himself knew about the plot and was encouraging it. Bechuanaland wasn't transferred, but Chamberlain did agree to cede a strip of land which flanked the Transvaal border. This, on paper of course, was just for the railway line. Shortly afterwards, the company was authorized to, quote, appoint and control a force sufficient to maintain peace, order, and good government in the territory, end quote. The resident commissioner was to be Dr. Jameson. Soon enough, the plan seemed to be ready. Jameson had been busy, and a rising in Johannesburg had been planned for the end of December. Jameson had been given an undated letter calling for him to rescue the, quote, thousands of unarmed men, women, and children of our race at the mercy of well-armed Boers, end quote. At the appropriate time, he was to date the letter and march into the Transvaal. As the day of the rising approached, however, the Outlanders began to get cold feet. The rifles they had been given fell short of what was expected. A plan to seize the Pretoria arsenal fell apart due to lack of recruits, and it was discovered that Jameson's force was far smaller than what had been discussed. Worst of all, everyone felt that keeping the rising quiet was impossible. Confusion eventually gave way to panic, and messages were fired off begging Jameson to postpone the rising. Rhodes was contacted and asked to call off the raid, but instead of contacting Jameson directly, he left it to Dr. Harris to sound the alarm. Now, however, it was too late. Jameson took little notice of the telegrams he was receiving. He remarked, quote, I received so many messages today, now telling me to come, then to delay starting, that I thought it best to make up their minds for them, before the Boers had time to get together, end quote. Jameson had heard that the Transvaal government was beginning to get word of the rising, and he felt it was now or never. On the 28th of December, Jameson was shown a Reuters message which had been published in the South African press. Quote, the position is becoming acute, and persistent rumours are afloat of secret arming of miners and warlike preparations. Women and children are leaving the Rand, end quote. Jameson wired to Harris, quote, unless I hear definitely to the contrary, shall leave tomorrow evening, and it will be all right, end quote. Jameson did not hear to the contrary, and he had the telegraph wires to the Cape severed. The all-important line to the Transvaal, however, remained open. It appeared that the fellow assigned to cut it got drunk and messed up his task. Jameson mustered his men and dated the fake letter calling for help. It was read out to the troops, and off they went. The ride was far more grueling than imagined, and soon enough, the men were suffering from fatigue and hunger. At the first evening halt, Jameson received a message from a Boer commander warning him off. This was one of several similar messages that he ignored. On New Year's Day, when the force was merely 30 miles from Johannesburg, things took a more serious turn. A letter came in from a British agent in Pretoria informing him that Her Majesty's government disapproved of the operation, and then notes came from Johannesburg confirming that the rising was off, and that the reformers were negotiating with Kruger. Then the inevitable happened, and the raid ran right into a well-prepared Boer ambush. The raiders put up a brave but futile counteraction. Soon enough, Jameson's raiders had no choice but to surrender. 17 had been killed, 35 were missing, and 55 were wounded. When Rhodes got the news, he fell to pieces, prepared to offer his resignation as PM, and shut himself up in his bedroom. He claimed it was the end for him, and quite rightly stated, quote, the Dutch will never forgive me, end quote. For 6 days he barely slept, rarely went out, and worried himself sick. Eventually, he pulled himself together and made straight for Kimberley, where he was greeted by deafening cheers. Rhodes declared, quote, in times of political adversity, people come to know who their friends are, and I am glad that at this period, I can count on so many friends on the diamond fields, end quote. He then told the crowd not to listen to the rumours that his career was finished. Quote, on the contrary, I think it is only just beginning, and I have a firm belief I will live to do much good and useful work on behalf of this community, end quote. Cecil then headed off to get his affairs in order at the De Beers office. The company, however, was to be more tricky. Part of his terms for the charter was that he not bring the crown into disrepute, yet he had just staged a blatantly illegal raid, and Joseph Chamberlain had now since come out and publicly repudiated the raid and the raiders. He, obviously, had no choice. Soon enough, Rhodes learned that Jameson and his officers were being shipped to England to be dealt with by the British authorities. On the 15th of January, 1896, Rhodes set off to join them. He was absolutely determined to resolve the situation and hold on to his company. Later in April, Rhodes would end up paying for the release of many of the leading raiders and members of the Reform Committee, one of whom was his own brother. Frank Rhodes and 3 of his companions had been sentenced to death, but for £25,000 each, their freedom was secured. Later, Rhodes and Alfred Beit would estimate that the raid had cost them nearly £400,000 each. Upon arrival in England, Rhodes fully expected a show of public support. The Kaiser had actually helped in this regard. He had rushed to telegraph President Kruger and congratulated him on maintaining his independence against armed bands, as he put it. This so incensed the British public that instead of condemning the raiders, they actually rallied in support of Rhodes even harder. Some years later, Rhodes was to thank the Kaiser for this intervention. Quote, "I was a naughty boy, and you tried to whip me. Now, my people were quite ready to whip me for being a naughty boy, but you did it. They said, 'No, if this is anybody's business, it is ours.' The result was that your majesty got yourself very much disliked by the English people, and I never got whipped at all." End quote. Once Rhodes stepped off the train at Paddington, he was immediately reassured. Quote, "I found all the busmen smiling at me when I came to London, and then I knew it was all right." End quote. Rhodes eventually went off to meet Chamberlain, and together they sought to find a way out of this messy situation. Most importantly, Rhodes was quite happy to cover for Chamberlain. Lord Selborne, Chamberlain's secretary, later said that the discussion was, quote, "most satisfactory, and that Rhodes has shown a great deal of common sense." End quote. Rhodes, for his part, returned to his hotel in high spirits regarding the future of his company. After a meeting with the London directors, he was back off to Africa. After going via Italy, Rhodes arrived in Berea, Mozambique, on the 20th of March. His arrival could not have been better timed. On the 24th of March, 4 days after Rhodes's arrival back in Africa, the Matabele had begun to attack isolated white settlements. Women and children were not spared, and in fact were specifically targeted in the most gruesome possible ways. With the company's police force seriously depleted by the raid, this was an extremely worrying development. Rhodesia was undergoing nothing less than a full-scale rebellion. The whole ordeal was hardly surprising. The white man had simply gotten complacent. The once proud Matabele had in one swoop been reduced to serfdom. Any land that was worth anything was parcelled up immediately, especially to the upper classes. Sir William Milton, later administrator of Rhodesia, said he was amazed to the extent to which the country had been handed over to the, quote, "honourable and military elements," end quote. Quote, "Jameson has given nearly the whole country to the Willoughbys, Whites, and others of that class. It is perfectly sickening to see the way in which the country has been run for the sake of hobnobbing with Lord this and the Honourable that. I think Jameson must have been off his head for some time before the raid." End quote. Worst of all for the Matabele was the loss of their cattle. Lobengula's cattle had essentially been the Matabele's cattle, and it was Lobengula's cattle that had been seized and redistributed amongst the settlers. It was estimated that the Matabele now had less than 1/5 of the cattle that they had possessed before. Worst of all, the deadly rinderpest disease swept the lands and carried off even more of the cattle. Lord Grey, administrator of Rhodesia from 1894 to 1897, wrote to his son, quote, "All the plagues of Egypt have tumbled at once upon this unhappy country. Drought, locusts, failure of crops, total annihilation of the cattle by rinderpest, no milk, no beef in a few days, but lots of lovely smells from dead cattle." End quote. The Matabele, then, were left with no land and no livelihood. They now had to accept essentially living as a native workforce for the white man if they wished to stay on their old lands. The rebellion at large is better suited to a video on Rhodesia itself rather than one on the life of Cecil Rhodes, but regardless, Brian Roberts writes of the brutality of what was later known as the Second Matabele War. Quote, "Details of the early killings are horrific. Isolated farms, mines, and trading stores were stormed. Houses were broken into and entire families massacred. The unsuspecting settlers were taken completely by surprise. At one farmhouse, the occupants were just about to sit down to their midday meal when a party of Matabele burst in and battered them to death. The only survivor was a 7-year-old girl who fled to a nearby river where she was discovered a few days later by some Matabele women who smashed her head with a stone. A native commissioner was seated at his desk writing a letter when he was stabbed in the back. Fred Salu later saw the remains of the Forey family. The father and 3 children were missing, and bodies of a woman and 3 other children, clubbed to death with knobkerries and axes, had been savaged by dogs or jackals. But, he says, the long fair hair of the young Dutch girls was still intact, and it is needless to say that the blood-stained tresses awoke the most bitter wrath in the hearts of all those who looked upon them, Englishmen, Dutchmen alike, vowing a pitiless vengeance against the whole Matabele race." End quote. Rhodes himself was on his way to Salisbury when news of the uprising reached him. He was struck down with a fever, but once he began to recover, he insisted on joining the relief column that was on its way from Salisbury to Bulawayo. Rhodes, despite not naturally being a brave man, insisted on being at the forefront of this dangerous march. He, like Hitler and Napoleon, trusted in Providence that this would not be his end. One of his companions recalled, quote, He quite thinks that he was not intended to be killed by a damned N-word. He is also a great fatalist, end quote. Elsewhere, the imperial government had insisted on getting involved due to the sheer scale of the rising, and they, too, had sent 200 regulars northwards to assist. For Rhodes, it was imperative that he got there first. Rhodes, like the settlers themselves, was filled with a violent bloodlust as he headed north. He was absolutely convinced that the Matabele had to be taught a lesson. He ordered that even those who surrendered should be shot. Quote, "You should kill all you can. It serves as a lesson to them when they talk things over at night. They count up the killed and say, so-and-so is dead, and so-and-so is no longer here, and they begin to fear you," end quote. On the 1st of June, Rhodes's column reached Bulawayo, which was still under siege, but was no longer in such imminent danger. The Matabele had wasted their opportunity to swamp the town with their sheer numbers, and had allowed the defenders to get organized. This did not mean things were easy. The inhabitants of Bulawayo had undergone horrifying suffering. Frederick Burnham, for example, had lost his beloved baby girl, and was absolutely consumed by the need for revenge. Everyone had lost someone. The mere sight of Rhodes was enough to send morale sky high. Everyone knew the tables had now turned. J.G. MacDonald wrote, quote, "No one ever received a greater welcome. The settlers, who were all lagered up in the market square, felt as if their troubles were at an end. Men and women united in cheering themselves hoarse, and an air of cheerfulness at once took the place of the depressed that had affected everyone for many weeks. Now that Rhodes is here, everything will be all right," was heard on every side, end quote. In Bulawayo, Rhodes spoke to his people, quote, "The population could not always remain purely native. This country will be the abode of a white race. If I am allowed to remain and work with you, I look in the future for the charter to lapse and for you to become a self-governing body, and that, as speedily as possible, become another state in South Africa, and it will be my duty to think out the plan by which that self-governing state may be created, with the greatest advantage to yourselves. But as to Transvaal or Cape Absorption, that is impossible," end quote. Of the lands above the Zambezi, he said, quote, "The country north of that river you must look upon as your own," end quote. On the 6th of June, a clash took place just outside of the town, and the Matabele were absolutely trounced and scattered off towards the Matopo Hills. The settlers had certainly got their revenge. Burnham, for example, wandered around the battlefield, executing any injured Matabele he could find. On the 3rd week of June, the Mashona decided to join the rising. Given recent history, of course, this was the most absurd betrayal possible. In a matter of days, 120 white men, women, and children had been slaughtered. To Rhodes, however, this was seen as a sideshow. He wanted to solve the Matabele problem here and now. His bloodlust had now since turned into something else. Most of all, Rhodes wanted peace. Flushing the Matabele out of the Matopos was never going to be an easy task, and something approaching a stalemate was being reached. Getting even more men involved would cost Rhodes a lot of time and money that he simply wasn't prepared to spend. Worst of all, if events dragged out, then he might well lose the company. Ending this whole ordeal would require something a lot more dramatic. A patrol at one point picked up an old woman in one of the deserted kraals. This turned out to be a widow of Mzilikazi, the founder of the Matabele. One of her sons, Nyanda, was one of the rebel leaders. After a lot of persuasion, she agreed to act as a go-between. She was carried back to her kraal and given a white flag. The rebels, she was told, were to wave this flag if they wanted peace. 2 or 3 days later, the flag was seen fluttering in the distant hills, and Rhodes took it as the signal he had been waiting for. He sent 4 Africans to go and talk to the rebels, which led to protracted and tentative talks. It was agreed, however, that Rhodes himself would meet the rebel Indunas on the 21st of August. Rhodes could only bring a few men, and this brought obvious risks, given that he and his companions would be entirely at the rebels' mercy. Regardless, he was willing to chance it. Quote, "We must risk it. I believe they mean well," end quote. After a nervous trek, Rhodes and his men eventually reached the Matabele procession. As the blacks carrying their white flag approached, Rhodes whispered, quote, yes, there they are. This is one of those moments in life that make it worth living. Here they come," end quote. The blacks then laid out their grievances. Quote, "You came, you conquered. The strongest takes the land. We accepted your rule. We lived under you, but not as dogs. If we are to be dogs, it is better to be dead. Children of the stars can never be dogs," end quote. Rhodes listened and understood. He acknowledged the wrongs which the Matabele had suffered and promised them that things would change. He then asked them why they had killed women and children. The Black Horde immediately became agitated, and angry gestures were made as they all talked aggressively between themselves. Eventually, however, Rhodes managed to calm things down, and by the time the sun was setting, the Indaba ended. A settlement had not been reached, but evidently, a huge step in the right direction had been taken. Rhodes had promised to disband the much-hated native police, which the company had used to enforce the law, and going into the next meeting, Rhodes quite rightly felt very optimistic. This meeting came a week later, and was more difficult than the last one. Many younger warriors, who quite frankly had no impulse control, kept interrupting the proceedings with bizarre calls to continue the fighting. Eventually, Rhodes left his companions and spoke to the rebels himself in an attempt to smooth things over. One of the mindless younger warriors aggressively asked where the Matabele were to live when all this was over. Rhodes responded, quote, "We will give you settlements. We will set apart locations for you. We will give you land," end quote. The young warrior then lost all control and began screaming, quote, "You will give us land in our own country? That's very good of you," end quote. Eventually, some of the older Indunas had to come along, and they employed a little more logic and agreed to Rhodes's compromise. This was not the end of things, but once again, Rhodes left the meeting confident that he was heading in the right direction. Philip Jordan wrote of his employer at this time, quote, "Mr. Rhodes's physical strength and power of endurance were phenomenal at this time. Sometimes the morning ride extended from 5 a.m. until 12 noon, and when it is considered that at that time of year, the rays of the sun beat down very fiercely from 9 o'clock in the morning, increasing in intensity as the day advanced, some idea can be formed of Mr. Rhodes's stamina," end quote. It was during these rides that Rhodes stumbled upon a hill which became known as World's View. He was so captured by it that he demanded that his entire party accompany him to it on a return visit. Walking backwards and forwards on the crest of the hill, he suddenly announced, quote, "I shall be buried here," end quote. There were more inconclusive indabas, but the final one came on the 13th of October. Here, the remaining grievances were ironed out. Effectively, many of the former chiefs were promised welfare, or rather, a salary, if they agreed to do what they were told. This was enough for the Matabele. Rhodes had secured a cheap peace that hardly pleased the settlers, but regardless, the rebellion was over. There was no time to celebrate, however. Rhodes had to make himself present in London for the official inquiry into the Jameson raid. Before going to London, it was necessary for him to pay a visit to the Cape, too, whereupon he discovered that his beloved house had been gutted by fire. When he got the news, all the colour drained from his face. Rhodes returned from Rhodesia by sea via Durban and Port Elizabeth before finally making his way to the Cape. From the second he stepped ashore, he was mobbed by his supporters. At a huge gathering of them at Port Elizabeth, he remarked, quote, "It is a good thing to have a period of adversity. You then find out who your real friends are." In Cape Town, his reception was so triumphant that he was overwhelmed and was reduced to tears. At a private dinner held in his honour, he announced, quote, "I can only say that I will do my best to make atonement for my error by untiring devotion to the best interests of South Africa," end quote. Rhodes stayed in the ruins of Groote Schuur until he left for London on the 6th of January, 1897. Before his departure, he was visited by many of his friends and supporters, including a large crowd who arrived one night in a torchlight procession and cheered him when he appeared on the balcony. Not everyone was happy with Rhodes, of course. The Boers, who had up until now been his staunchest allies in the form of the Bond, were quite rightly disgusted with his antics in the Transvaal, and they now abandoned him. When Jan Hofmeyer got the news of the raid, he said, quote, "as though the wife of his bosom had been torn from his side," end quote. Rhodes arrived in London and met with Chamberlain on the 26th of January in a bid to get the inquiry stopped altogether. Both men knew the stakes. Rhodes had the telegrams to prove Chamberlain's guilt in the raid. Chamberlain had the power to revoke Rhodes's charter. Rhodes, though, had met his match. He was forced to give way. He would attend the select committee, and he would suppress the telegrams. Chamberlain was to be a member of the committee, and Rhodes could count on his support. Chamberlain, in return, promised to retain the charter. The committee held its first public session on the 16th of February in Westminster Hall. Amongst those in attendance was the Prince of Wales, among others from high society. Of the proceedings, Brian Roberts writes, quote, "At first he appeared nervous, but he was soon to get the measure of his interrogators and parry their questions with an aplomb which bordered at times on impudence. His supporters were delighted with his performance." Rhodes attended the hearings twice a week for 3 weeks. The committee sat all day, and during the lunchtime sessions, Rhodes faced his examiners, sipping a glass of porter and chewing a sandwich. It made a good impression. He looked anything but a guilty man cornered by his opponents. In answering questions, he showed no signs of contrition. He freely admitted his responsibility for the raid, but went on to lecture the committee on the conditions in South Africa that had led up to it. Playing on the patriotism of his wider audience, there were 33 press representatives present. He emphasized that threat which Germany posed to British interests in Africa and his desire for a union of South African states under the British flag. By refusing to answer questions which might incriminate a third party, he was able to sidestep issues concerning his dealings with British officials, nor would he admit to having written instructions to his subordinates prior to the raid. "I never write letters," he said when taxed on this point. Both these evasions were obligingly accepted by the committee. End quote. In the end, Rhodes managed to sail through the proceedings with relative ease and got let off lightly. On the 20th of April, he was back in the Cape, and as usual, met by hundreds of his supporters. He told them that he had returned to, quote, strive for equal rights for every white man south of the Zambezi, end quote. A day later, he attended the House of Assembly, his first parliamentary appearance since he had resigned as PM. His interest in Cape politics, however, was limited compared to his interest in the company and Rhodesia. In May, he set off north and would remain in Rhodesia for the rest of the year. On the entire route north, wherever he went, he was mobbed by English settlers and treated like a king. No matter what the world thought, he was still a hero to the English of South Africa. In Rhodesia itself, though, Rhodes was bombarded by his settlers for another reason. Rhodes' secretary at the time, Gordon Lasseau, recalls that they, quote, stood 12 deep outside the door with petitions for all manner of things. One wanted to set up a business, another a farm, another a span of oxen and a wagon, and yet another to have his claim for compensation revised, end quote. These people had all lost everything during the uprising, and most of them blamed the Jameson raid due to it stripping the colony of its police force. Many were richly rewarded by Rhodes. Lasseau remembers that Rhodes was, quote, giving away money during these months at an enormous rate. Numbers of men whom it was found impossible to get employment for, or who were ill, were during 1896 and 1897 given free passes home to England by Rhodes, and on one occasion he paid the passage to Cape Town of a whole circus troupe whom he found stranded, end quote. Rhodes' time in Rhodesia was a strange one. He lived in a camp with his close confidants, and to him this was the peak of existence. He simply couldn't be happier. His health, however, was failing. Fever struck him down, but more importantly his heart was declining fast, and he would often visit his chosen burial site and worry about the end being near. To Lasseau, he remarked before pointing to his heart, quote, You will probably die of cancer in the throat and linger on in agony, but I shall go off suddenly without any pain. I may go off while I am talking to you now. This will kill me, but I shan't suffer, end quote. Rhodes didn't exactly help himself during this time with his drinking habits. He drank to excess more often than not, and he thought nothing of finishing 2 bottles of champagne in one sitting. In terms of food, he scoffed down massive quantities of red meat, potatoes, and starchy foods. Despite his health, Rhodes pushed on and partook in the next South African election, this time on behalf of the Progressive Party. James Rose Ines, a member of the Cape Parliament, wrote home, quote, he gave people in England to understand that he would sweep the board. He is idolized by the English public, excepting only a sane remnant, really, though not avowedly, because he is opposed by the Dutch. The man has no moral courage, and never has. He goes on making big, clever, clumsy speeches, but always in constituencies where the issue is not in real doubt. He never ventures in his tour to be at a really Bond district, end quote. But this was true in every regard. Rhodes's friends were apprehensive that he would even win his usual seat in Berkeley West, so he also ran in Namicaland West. In the end, Rhodes did win his usual seat, but his party was easily bested. The Progressives polled heavily in the towns, but their opponents won the countryside. Despite all this, Rhodes would continue to represent Berkeley West for the rest of his life. This, though, was nothing to Rhodes. He had no taste for opposition politics, and clearly his comeback had been far too soon. The Dutch simply had not, and never would, forgive him. Still, he did genuinely love them, but they stood in the way of his grand plans for a united South Africa. To Rhodes, it was just business. To the Dutch, it was a threat to their very existence. Rhodes would remark, quote, it is I who will have to compromise with them and their continental gang. Some of my greatest friends are Dutch. Those are the people we are going to fight. We shall want all our discipline and all our organization and unity for the fight, but it will come all right later on. I may not live to see it, but you will all be putting up statues to me, end quote. After a few sittings of the new parliament, he simply gave up and began to focus almost exclusively on the company and her territories. Cecil Rhodes arrived back in England in January 1899 to continue negotiations regarding the extension of the railway into Rhodesia. Time for him was clearly running out, and he wanted to use his last few years purposefully. His dream of the white man pushing ever further north had to be hurried along. It was whilst he was in London that Rhodes produced his last will and testament. Inside, Rhodes gave specific instructions regarding his burial in the Metopos. He bequeathed his English estates to his family and his Rhodesian estates to the Rhodesians themselves. Groot Schuur was to be retained as a park for the people until South Africa was united. Then it would become a residence for future prime ministers. £100,000 was left to Oriel College, Oxford. Rhodes then moved on to his idea regarding scholarships. Essentially, 60 scholarships were to be awarded annually to suitably qualified students, drawn from the various portions of the British Empire. A further 2 could be chosen from the United States of America. To qualify for a scholarship, a student had to meet certain requirements. Quote, his literary and scholastic attainments, his success in manly outdoor sports, his qualities of manhood, truth, courage, devotion to duty, sympathy for the protection of the weak, kindliness, unselfishness, and fellowship, and his exhibition during school days of moral force of character and instincts to lead and to take an interest in his schoolmates, end quote. Rhodes refused to open this scholarship to women, and of the criteria, he said the proportions were 4 temps for scholarship, 2 temps for athletics, 2 temps for manhood, and 2 temps for leadership. Rhodes, effectively, was trying to form a kind of mostly Anglo-Saxon colonial elite. He did especially envision the Dutch playing a part too in South Africa, and he reserved a scholarship for an Afrikaner university. The problem in general was, however, that he was placing the worthy above the unorthodox. It was strange men like himself with the will to power to push the boundaries of the empire. Instead, Rhodes was, like many men do, focusing far too much on elite institutions and strict guidelines. It's unlikely that he would even have qualified for one of his own scholarships as a youngster. Shortly after arriving in London, Rhodes was off again, this time to Egypt with an old Oxford friend. Together they negotiated an agreement by which Rhodes's transcontinental telegraph line would be connected to Egypt. On the route home, Rhodes stopped by Berlin, where he was warmly received by Kaiser Wilhelm. The two got on surprisingly well and were easily able to joke about the Kaiser's notorious telegram after the Jameson raid. Rhodes left confident that his telegraph line would be continued through German East Africa, and it is probably as a result of this meeting that 15 German students were later included amongst those eligible for the Rhodes Scholarship. The Kaiser, as a sign of goodwill, had previously made English compulsory in German schools. Of the Kaiser, Rhodes remarked, quote, he is a big man. The German people are very fortunate in having such an emperor who spends his whole day in efforts for his people, end quote. The Kaiser was equally as complimentary. He remarked to the British ambassador, quote, what a man he is. Why is he not my minister? With him, I could do anything, end quote. Rhodes once more set off for South Africa, and, as usual, he was given a hero's welcome. The Cape Times observed, quote, the extraordinary outburst of public enthusiasm with which Mr. Rhodes was welcomed may fairly be taken as marking another epoch in his career, end quote. During his journey to South Africa, and afterwards, Rhodes, to his dismay, was accompanied by Princess Catherine Radziwill. Rhodes was by now a sick man, and he had never been fond of women. All throughout the journey, this Russo-Polish princess, who had been expelled from the German court, was throwing herself at Rhodes in the most embarrassing ways, and day after day she would place herself at Rhodes's table. Here, she would repeat stories, often graphic, in which she would essentially trash all the royalty of Europe and reveal all their business in an attempt to seem impressive. Rhodes was frankly disgusted by this woman, and her attempts to come onto him became ever more embarrassing, to the point where he was just spending his days ignoring her. Things were no better upon landfall. Roberts writes, quote, far more obvious was his reaction to the princess's continual presence at Groot Schuur. Once she had established herself as a visitor, she dropped all pretense of politeness and began turning up at the house, uninvited and unexpected, at all hours of the day. There was no escaping her. So confident was she of a welcome that she would demand to see Rhodes the moment she arrived, and, if he was out or busy, she would plonk herself down and wait for him. Not surprisingly, Rhodes found this highly disconcerting. He began to dread the princess's visits, and at times became visibly agitated at the very mention of her name. He would go to any lengths to avoid meeting her, and even, it is said, kept a horse permanently saddled so that he could make a quick getaway whenever she appeared at his gate. More than anything else, Rhodes hated being alone with the princess. He gave his staff and his friends strict instructions never to leave his side when she was present, and would get extremely flustered at the thought of being trapped in a room with her, end quote. Eventually, Rhodes exploded at her, and eventually told her, quote, she had better not speak to him at all, end quote. At around the same time, the princess was caught sneaking into Rhodes's office. This was something she often did, and she began thumbing through his papers. This time, though, she stole something, and was caught by Rhodes's secretary, Philip Jordan. At the time, the princess went about dropping hints that her and Rhodes were intimate, and she even implied that soon she would live at his house permanently as his wife. This, of course, wasn't true at all. Cecil Rhodes was stone cold to women, and especially promiscuous ones. Later, however, the princess would make up all sorts of stories and attempted to blackmail Rhodes with whatever these papers were. Except for these bizarre relations with the princess, however, this was a time of domesticity for Rhodes. He simply no longer had the energy for an active life. Outside the walls of Grutshire, however, things were as energetic as ever. The entire country was gripped by war fever, and this was perhaps why Rhodes was greeted so lavishly in the first place. Rhodes himself always insisted that it would never come to war. He remarked of President Kruger, quote, "Kruger will bluff up to the cannon's mouth," end quote. The old man, however, was willing to fight. On the 9th of October 1899, President Kruger issued an ultimatum demanding that British troops be withdrawn from the borders of the Transvaal, and that all points of differences between the two countries be referred to arbitration. The British took this as the declaration of war that it was. Only then was Rhodes stirred into action and he set off for Kimberley on the Transvaal border. The day after Rhodes' arrival, the ultimatum expired, and 3 days later, the Boers surrounded the town, cut the telegraph wires, and dislocated the railway line. Initially, there was some resentment at Rhodes' arrival, but this quickly evaporated. For many, he seemed to be the only man capable of solving the problems that faced the civilian population. One of his first moves was to cook up a scheme for repairing the streets of Kimberley, which provided work for the thousands of refugees, regardless of colour. He also handed over a hoard of weapons which had been hidden in the town for the Jameson raid. During the siege, he was always there, encouraging those who were wavering or listening to their complaints. Many feared for his safety, given that he always seemed to be wherever the action was. One young woman gushed, quote, "I really do not know what we should have done without Mr. Rhodes. His name will ever mean that of a true friend to everyone who is in Kimberley," end quote. With the military, Rhodes had a more strained relationship. It was as if there were two commanders, not one. Rhodes constantly flouted orders and insisted on taking charge of the situation himself. He always felt he knew best. Chamberlain remarked that if Kimberley, quote, had had any other British commander than Kekwich, Rhodes would have been in jail, end quote. For 4 months, the town remained under siege. It wasn't until the beginning of February 1900 that the long-awaited relief column arrived. An estimated 8,500 shells had been fired into the town beforehand, and towards the end, things had been so intense that Rhodes had opened up the diamond mines as shelters. To General Keckwich's embarrassment, the relief column completely missed him. By the time he returned to town, he found a Rhodes-hosted champagne party in full swing with General French, the town's reliever. When Rhodes returned from Kimberley, he found that Princess Radziwill had been attempting to form a united political party with his enemies in his name. This obviously was not something he condoned, and he was far from happy. She continued to turn up at Grutshire regardless, and Rhodes had to tell her to just go away. She asked, quote, "What can one do with you, Mr. Rhodes?" end quote. Cecil responded, quote, "Leave me alone," end quote. In the end, Rhodes came up with an ingenious scheme to get rid of her. She ran up a mountain of debt back in England. Rhodes offered to pay for it all in full. In return, she had to leave him alone and return to England, which she did, but only for a little while. Whilst in London, she continued banding around the claim that her and Rhodes were to be married, and she even used his name in several attempted scams. Soon enough, she was back in South Africa and outright trying to blackmail him. After a stressful trip to Rhodesia, Rhodes was back in Cape Town and struck down with fever. Here, he could barely get a second away from her, and her persistence made her former efforts look like child's play. When she attempted to openly blackmail him to his face, however, Rhodes caused a huge scene and didn't see her for a long time. This didn't stop her antics, however, and she had been all over Cape Town taking out loans using a forged signature of Rhodes's. In the end, the tired Rhodes just brought legal action against her. He was much smarter and far more experienced in this game than she was. On the 6th of February, 1902, Rhodes was summoned to the Supreme Court at Cape Town. He was by now 48 and seriously ill. Before this, an English doctor had recommended a long rest and a change of surroundings. This was followed by a 2-month spell of shooting up in Scotland. One of his visitors, amongst many up here, was the young Winston Churchill. Before his return to the Cape, he had attempted a trip up the Nile with Jameson, but it did him little good. Jameson suggested they abandon the tour. Gordon Lassault met Rhodes at the London docks and was appalled at his appearance. Quote, "His face was bloated, almost swollen, and he was livid with a purple tinge in his face, and I realized he was very ill indeed. I mumbled something about being glad to see him when I shook hands, but I felt too shocked to say much," end quote. Everyone warned Rhodes not to return to the Cape for the court summons, but he absolutely refused to listen. He had to be there for his own sake. The princess was willing to produce all sorts of forged nonsense in court, as well as the papers she had stolen. For the sake of his own reputation, Rhodes felt he had no choice, even if going all the way to South Africa was essentially a death sentence. He arrived on the 4th of February without the usual fanfare. His arrival was only noted in a brief notice in the local papers. For his court appearance 2 days later, however, there was no shortage of publicity. Everyone wanted to see these mysterious papers that the princess possessed. It was romantic, not political secrets, which the people wished to see. They were all to be disappointed. The princess got cold feet, pleaded illness, and didn't show up. The case went ahead without her, and the documents were seen by the judge as the forgeries which they were. This didn't stop her, however, and she kept causing more of a fuss. During February, Rhodes exploded, quote, "Damn that woman, can't she leave me alone?" End quote. The princess was worrying the poor man to death. On the 20th of February, the two came face to face for the last time at the preliminary hearing for the case in which she was charged with using a forged document. 2 months later, the princess was charged with 24 counts of fraud and forgery in Cape Town's Supreme Court. The result was a foregone conclusion. She was sentenced to 2 years in a house of correction. After serving 16 months, she was deported, and as soon as she arrived back in Europe, she started proceedings against the Rhodes trustees. She claimed a ridiculous £1.4 million on the grounds that Rhodes was the father of a female child delivered to her in December 1897. This, of course, went nowhere. It was pure bluff. Aside from the princess's shenanigans, Rhodes spent his time pacing around Groot Schuur, desperately trying to ease his breathing. He could often be seen stretched out on a couch in a darkened room with his shirt unbuttoned and his chest heaving. As the weeks passed, he grew worse and worse. Dr. Edmund Stevenson, who attended to him every evening, recalled that Rhodes was, quote, "unable to leave his bed, and owing to him being unable to breathe when lying down, a contrivance was made which kept him suspended. Then, to help the breathing, a double ceiling was made, into which oxygen gas was pumped." End quote. Rhodes could only lay there panting and sweating until his face turned purple, as his friends took it in turns to sit with him. Things soon took a turn for the worst. For the last 3 days of his life, Cecil Rhodes was barely conscious. Friends came and went, but he hardly stirred and was oblivious to what was going on around him. The end came at 5:57 p.m. on the 26th of March, as he was surrounded by his closest friends. Jameson was given the task of going out later that evening and announcing Rhodes' death to the crowd, which had formed outside. Many had waited for days on end, hoping that he would recover, or to see his last hours. Despite all that had happened, he was loved and adored by his people. The road outside had been absolutely thronged with people. To this crowd, Jameson read out Rhodes' last coherent words, quote, "So little done, so much to do," end quote. Rhodes' body was placed in a coffin of Rhodesian teak and taken to Groot Schuur. For the next 2 days, messages of sympathy, tributes, and wreaths flooded in from all across the world. All across the Cape, flags were flown at half-mast, and a never-ending stream of teary-eyed people filed past the coffin in respectful silence. The coffin was then taken to the House of Assembly, where for another full day it lay in state. On the 3rd of April, an impressive funeral service was held in St. George's Cathedral. Afterwards, the coffin was covered in a Union Jack, placed on a gun carriage, and escorted to a special train through the crowded streets. From here, Rhodes was taken on a 5-day journey to Bulawayo. At all the stations en route, crowds had formed, buglers sounded the last post, and military bands played. The most impressive display of mourning was in Kimberley. Here, a guard of honor from the Kimberley Regiment lined the entire length of the platform. A procession, led by the mayor, filed past the carriage containing the coffin. 4 entire hours would pass as over 15,000 people of all races paid their homage to South Africa's greatest hero that evening. In Bulawayo, there was another very large crowd, and a second funeral service was held in the drill hall, conducted by the Bishop of Mashonaland. On the 10th of April, his coffin was taken to his Matopo farm, before being hauled by a team of oxen to the top of World's View the following morning. Some 2,500 Matabele gathered on the hillside to watch, as the gun carriage carrying the coffin passed them by. As it did so, they all rose to their feet and gave the royal salute, the first time any such honour had been accorded to a white man. The grave had already been prepared, and Rhodes was lowered into it after a simple ceremony attended by a crowd of white settlers. Despite everything, Cecil Rhodes still remains there in that rock until this day. Following his death, there was not enough Cecil Rhodeses to continue his dreams. Within 2 generations, the British Empire was crumbling. Even his beloved Rhodesians, despite their best efforts, were unable to hold back the tide. Cecil Rhodes' memory as one of Britain's greatest sons, however, much like his grave on World's View, will be there for eternity. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, then please do leave a like. It helps immensely. And especially a big thank you to those of you who have signed up to my subscribe star or as a YouTube member. Now that I've been banned from Patreon, I cannot put into words how much it helps. And without these kind subscriptions, I would not even remotely be able to do these videos. Thank you very much.